Hi, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to today's sold-out program, The Life of Japanese Americans at Seabrook Farm During the Second World War. My name is Kim Andrews, and I'm the Executive Director of the Japan-America Society of Greater Philadelphia. Since its origins at Shifuso Japanese House and Garden in 1982 as Friends of the Japanese House and Garden, JSGP works to make Philadelphia a recognized center of Japanese arts, business, and culture in the United States and beyond, attracting more regional, national, and international visitors to the area. JSGP elevates the practice of Japanese arts and culture in the region, using the preserved site of Shifuso as its centerpiece and increasing Philadelphia's national and international prominence by expanding interchange in business and public policy with Japan. You can find information about our work, our programs, and Shifuso at japanphilly.org. Each year, January 30th is Fred Korematsu Day, honoring the Japanese American civil rights activist. The Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties and the Constitution honors the legacy of Japanese American civil rights activist Fred Korematsu, who was born in Oakland, California in 1919 and died in 2005. In 1942, Korematsu resisted the imprisonment of Japanese descent American citizens following Executive Order 9066, which authorized the forced relocation and incarceration of Japanese Americans to guarded concentration camps in the United States interior following the attack on Pearl Harbor. After Korematsu's arrest, he became the test case to challenge the constitutionality of the government's confinement without due process of American citizens during wartime. After being tried and found guilty in federal court, Korematsu appealed to the U.S. Court of Appeals, and in December 1944, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the compulsory exclusion was justified during times of war. Korematsu's case was reopened by a pro bono legal team, and in 1983, a California judge formally overturned Korematsu's conviction. Korematsu became a member of the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations, along with Friends of the Japanese House and Garden founding board member Grace Uyehara and many others, to successfully lobby Congress to sign reparations legislation for Japanese Americans. Korematsu remained an outspoken critic of racial and religious discrimination, eventually receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Bill Clinton in 1998. Beginning in 2010, Fred Korematsu Day has been commemorated in California, Georgia, Florida, Hawaii, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Utah, and Virginia. For more information, please visit korematsuinstitute.org. To highlight Fred Korematsu Day, JSGP and the Inclusiveness and Diversity Committee of Penn's Village are co-hosting this online lecture and discussion with participants Masaru Edmund Nakawatase, Alfred Hirotoshi Nishikawa, and Rob Buscher on the history of Seabrook farms and Japanese Americans during and after the Second World War. Many thanks to partner Penn's Village, the participants who have given their time and expertise to be here today, and organizer Yuka Yokoyama, Associate Director of Exhibits and Programs at JSGP. Today's program, The Life of Japanese Americans at Seabrook Farms During the Second World War, focuses on the history of Japanese American families who were relocated from American concentration camps in 1944 and employed at Seabrook Farms in southern New Jersey, about an hour drive from Philadelphia. Seabrook Farms, now called Seabrook Brothers and Sons, established by Charles F. Seabrook in 1913, processes vegetables through flash freezing and dehydration. After the Pearl Harbor attack by the Japanese Empire, over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were mass incarcerated in American concentration camps located in the interior of the country. A Supreme Court ruling in 1944 paved the way for camps to close, but most incarcerees remained in prison until the end of 1945, with the final prisoners leaving Tule Lake Camp in March of 1946. In 1944, Mr. Seabrook worked with the War Relocation Authority to employ over 2,500 Japanese Americans to work at his company. They were paid for their labor and offered welfare accommodations such as housing, medical treatment, and education. Even today, many descendants of these earlier Japanese American farm workers live in Seabrook and its neighboring area. Now, I'd like to introduce Harry Sakamaki of the Inclusiveness and Diversity Committee of Penn's Village, a nonprofit that assists older neighbors to live independently in their own homes. Please hang on for 1 minute while we get Harry on screen.
Hi, everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties. It seems that we've lost Harry, but hopefully he'll be rejoining us shortly. In the meantime, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Rob Buscher, and I'm the president of the Japanese American Citizens League Philadelphia chapter. We are the local chapter of the national organization founded in 1929 by the sons and daughters of Japanese immigrants to fight on behalf of the civil rights and human rights of all peoples. Um, a lot of the work that we do today is remembering the legacy of the wartime incarceration and also advocating for other communities whom we see as having parallel experiences related to prejudice and discrimination in this country. Before we kind of get into the panel today, and I believe that Harry will probably be joining us to give some broader introductions, I wanted to give a little bit of context for the wartime incarceration and also the resettlement into Seabrook specifically, which Ed Masaru will be talking about in great length. So I'll just go ahead and get into a very short slideshow that I've prepared that has some images for reference here. When we think about World War II, there was an incredible amount of anti-Japanese racism related to the propaganda. And of course, Japanese Americans, like many other communities of color in the United States at that time, were really treated as second-class citizens, particularly in California, where the Japanese immigrant farmers over the last 30 years or so had really, by the 1940s, become among the most successful farming communities in the West Coast of the United States. And this upset some of the white nativists of California. So it wasn't a far stretch of the imagination that once Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, that the United States can be kind of dragged into this broader campaign of racialized propaganda that's really meant to sort of dehumanize the Japanese as an enemy race, really, because essentially the Nazis from Germany and the fascists in Italy were also subject to propaganda, but only the anti-Japanese propaganda dehumanized them to the extent that they no longer resemble human beings, as you can kind of see in these popular magazines and comic books. Unfortunately, that also spills over into the Japanese American community. And unfortunately for Japanese Americans, like my relatives who were living in the West Coast at the time, they were perceived as enemies, right? And the potentiality that they could actually be enemy spies or be planning some kind of sabotage, which is something that the popular press really grabbed a hold of. And of course, the various farming organizations, the farm growers associations of California that were controlled by the majority white community there at the time, very quickly called for the mass removal and forced incarceration of Japanese Americans. So these are just a couple of cartoons actually drawn by Dr. Seuss showing this kind of idea, how the Japanese Americans get caught up in this propaganda campaign. So unfortunately, as Kim mentioned, after Executive Order 9066 that was passed in February 19th, 1942, shortly thereafter, Japanese American communities begin receiving evacuation notices, and they are basically being forcibly evicted and mass incarcerated in temporary assembly centers and later in the relocation centers, 10 prison camps throughout the country, which are kind of located here on this map. You can see largely in the middle interior of the Rockies. A few of them were actually in California, and then as far east as Rower and Jerome in Arkansas. And so, these are some of the typical images that we might have seen at that time period. A lot of these places were placed into very remote desert areas, places that couldn't really support crop life. Were just basically land that had no purpose. And they were sending people here, tens of thousands, to inhabit these places. At first, with the idea that they could potentially colonize the land. They even called them colonists at one point. But quickly, the War Relocation Authority decided that it would be a better strategy to resettle individuals from these prison camps elsewhere in the country. And so, in time, the incarceration did extend until the end of the war, and many people were in the camps until they closed. But a lot of people also began resettling during the war years, and they were able to get temporary leaves and sometimes permanent leaves if a work sponsor would give them a position, and they could resettle basically anywhere east of the Rockies. Once the war did end, California begrudgingly allowed Japanese Americans back into the state. But as you can see from some of these photos, that they weren't always welcomed, right? And so a lot of people, both at the behest of the War Relocation Authority and because of this fear of the hostility or the vandalism that might occur, a lot of community members began resettling in the Midwest into different industrial cities around the Rust Belt region. Others came here to the East Coast, to cities like Philadelphia and New York. And so what Ed is going to be talking about after I finish this very brief slideshow is his experience growing up in the community of Bridgeton, New Jersey, where Seabrook Farms was located. And Seabrook Farms was kind of unique in a lot of ways, and I'll certainly let Ed talk more about it. But largely, their labor force was made up of a variety of displaced peoples, including European refugees from World War II, and about 300 Japanese American families who resettled directly from the incarceration camps. So this began during the war and continued into the post-war era, when several hundred families, basically thousands or so people, were in this region and working in the fields, working in the packing plants and the frozen goods section, and basically involved in the various labor that it took to get these farm goods shipped out for consumption. So they lived in this community that was paid for by the Seabrook Farms company, and they actually had housing that was provided for them, as well as a good wage. And so these are certainly a lot better than the tar paper barracks that people were living in. At the same time, they are fairly meager, a lot of these. And while they're no longer made of wood and tar paper, you can kind of see the somewhat shoddy construction on a lot of these housing units. But again, for a population that was sent to prison simply for being Japanese American, this was really a godsend for a lot of individuals in that era. So women were also involved in the labor force, and we can kind of see some of the images that were taken by the War Relocation Authority as part of their propaganda campaign, trying to show the peaceful resettlement of Japanese Americans into civilian life. There's also a lot of young people. This is the cafeteria, and we have a group of, looks like older high school or perhaps recent college graduates who are here working as well. But there were also kids, right? And so there's children that are growing up there, and this was kind of the experience that Ed is going to share about. But there's also older adolescents who are going to the local high school and being integrated into this community, which in a lot of ways was, I think Ed will talk more about this, but it seems to be fairly inclusive. And on the other side, Japanese Americans, because there were such large numbers, were actually able to recreate several things from the West Coast Japan towns, like the Japanese American softball teams that were popular, or even the women's basketball team that Seabrook Farms supported. And I think the last thing that I just want to kind of leave us with here, the Seabrook Temple, Buddhist temple in Bridgeton, New Jersey, is really significant in that it has the largest Obon, a festival celebrating the return of the deceased spirits of our ancestors once a year. And this is a tradition that's been going on since the post-war era and continues on till today. But in many ways, Seabrook was a very unique community because of the numbers of Japanese Americans who were there, creating sort of an insulation from some of the racism and hostility that many other Japanese American families faced, resettling in both the West Coast and in regions that were more sparsely populated. So that's all for the slides, and I hope that these images have given a little bit more context to the conversation that we're going to have now with Ed. I don't see Harry back on yet, so I'll go ahead and introduce Ed. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm not sure what all else we're going to say, but you know, I think I'll let you take it away.
All right. Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Harry, wherever you are. And thanks to the Japan America Society of Greater Philadelphia. It's a rare opportunity that most people have to talk about their childhood without having a therapist nearby, and I think it's a story that I've reviewed in my own mind many times, and so I appreciate this opportunity yet again to talk a little bit about growing up in Seabrook Farms, or Seabrook as we called it then and now. And let me add to the context that Kim and Rob have also set forth. The community of Seabrook is located in Upper Deerfield Township. As Kim noted, it's about an hour southeast of Philadelphia. It has an estimated population as of 2 years ago of about 7,300 people. And I think it was probably about 2/3 of that during the time I was growing up. And at the peak, also as noted, there were about 2,500 Japanese Americans that lived in the community. And it was a community that I think would be interesting to note some of the life that existed within it. I mean, my own personal story, and this is a personal story, basically, is that the life, looking back on it, and even feeling about it then, was that it was a good life. I've had much different and much more radical perspectives about the nature of race in the society, but growing up in Seabrook, as I've noted to anybody that asks, was a wonderful place. It's a wonderful time, and that baffles me at points too. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about that. The community itself was a place where most of the parents who lived in the community worked at Seabrook Farms, which meant that for much of the year we were regulated in part by the rhythms of the factory. During the peak periods, which were the summer and an early part of the fall, the work days were 12 hours generally. So you had 2 shifts, and certainly during the summer, the kids were pretty much. It was clearly noted that we kept quiet because of the shifts. In other words, there would be parents asleep during the daytime who were going on to night shift. It was a community which was Japanese American, certainly the circle that I hung out with, but it was also infused, and I think that's probably the right word here, later in the 40s, in the 1940s, by refugees primarily from the Baltic states and primarily from Estonia. These were people who in the wake of the Nazi-Soviet Pact were displaced, and many settled into Seabrook. the period I'm talking about here, which I think is pretty much the sort of prime period of settlement in Seabrook Farms, was from the late 40s up to about the early 70s, which a period that coincides with my growth, if you will, from preschool all the way to graduation and then beyond, from high school and then going on to college and then post-college. So that's the time frame that we're talking about. And to describe the community a little further, and some aspects of it have already been described, I would note that there were two religious groups, institutions in the community. One was the Buddhist temple. The other was the Seabrook Christian Church, which my grandparents were stalwart members of that. And they indeed had been Christians in Japan, even before they migrated to the United States at the turn of the 20th century. And there were other institutions looking back, and which I think bear further examination in terms of their impact on our lives. There was the Seabrook Community House, which had many aspects to it. I mean, one was it had an infirmary, it had a library, and I remember hanging out there a lot. It had public space where we played basketball, and some of us learned how to play, more or less. But it also doubled up as space for the Seabrook Christian Church on Sundays. And we had, so communal life in Seabrook was amazingly commonplace in talking about the period here, which was primarily the 1950s. And I wondered about that growing, as it was happening. The 1950s were a period where Seabrook, like all the rest of the United States, was becoming, well, they began to own televisions. They began to see some sense of a society larger than whatever it is we were living in, and not only in this country, but also beyond its borders. So it was an opening to a wider world. And we came out as sons and daughters of internees or prisoners. You can choose your term here. Who I think in some larger, unstated way, were seeking a degree of normality. I mean, my parents, like the other parents in the community, they were raised in a depression. And then you had the war. And then you had the internment. And then you had relocation. So there was clearly a desire, a push, implicit but not explicitly stated, about becoming like other Americans. And I've reflected on that experience quite a bit in terms of how direct an impact it had without anything ever being said about it. I mean, the 50s are, I think, accurately seen as a period of growing material wealth, for various reasons, political quietude, and a development of a expanding middle class. Seabrook as a community was a working class community. We were by any standards not rich. By no means were we anywhere near being rich, but it was a democratic community in that sense. There was no social hierarchy reflected among us. All the parents that I knew worked in the plant. They had some of the same jobs, and they worked perhaps in the same shifts. And it was an amazing, to me later, reflecting on this. Not only what did happen, how we developed, how we grew, but also what didn't happen, or what it is we had already, other people in our community had experienced. For example, I mean, as Japanese, we were a high visibility minority, and we certainly knew that there were epithets directed at us, or could be directed at us, but I never heard them growing up in the 50s. Nobody called me a Jap. Nobody talked about going back to Japan, I mean, permanently. And I think, and I have no research to back this up, but I suspect this is probably certainly a part of the truth, is the rougher road was probably ridden by the generation that preceded us. The Japanese Americans who came probably as school kids and teenagers in the 40s, and giving some context to the community in more broadly than I have. I mean, Seabrook and Upper Deerfield Township are part of Cumberland County. Now, Cumberland County was at that point one of the most conservative areas in the state of New Jersey. It had been one of the strongholds, actually, of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, when the Klan revived, not only as a racist organization, but also as an organization committed to opposing, often violently, immigration, and also they were anti-Catholic, as well as being, of course, anti-Semitic. So, and the community that I went to high school in, Bridgeton, which was the county seat, about 6 miles or so from Seabrook, was the municipal judge I was to discover, who was finishing out his life as municipal judge in about 1960, had been a leader in the Klan in Cumberland County and in New Jersey. It was an open kind of secret. His son was very active in the Klan later in the 60s, but there was nary a trace, at least a written word, about his history. And I think, and I'm sure that there's going to be more digging done there, and I might actually help in that digging. But we know. So I'm just trying to establish the general political context within which we lived. Except we didn't, to my memory, I mean, it had no direct negative experience. And that kind of astounds me to some extent when I reflect on it. But there it is. That's a fact. Growing up in the community, I think of it in almost idyllic terms. I mean, it was a community in which there was plenty of open space. There were lots of organized activities, as noted, not only with religious groups, but also there were athletic teams, many athletic teams, all the sports. There were scouts. There were summer camps. Summer camp that was an annual thing at Parvin State Park, which was located also about 6 miles away on the other side of Seabrook. So that it was a place, perhaps the most significant term that you could use to describe it was safe. I live in Philadelphia now. And if I lived in any other city as well, I suspect that there would be concerns in an urban area with anybody with kids about safety. and how school, how safely schools, et cetera, the streets. And that was an issue that we not only didn't talk about, we didn't even conceive of it. Of course you're safe. Um, you might stumble and fall, you might break a bone in a football game or something like that. But there was no sense that you were ever in danger, that there was no insecurity, and you had a number of operative factors. I mean, one is cultural. I mean, there was a general tendency, I mean, to obey your parents. You also had the additional discipline of you were part of a community where it was very clear that people needed their sleep if they were working the night shift. So you were quiet, and I don't know if this was explicitly stated as much, but you probably didn't want to do any harm to your family name, your family honor, if you will. Though I don't remember it ever being put in those terms to me directly. So there was this kind of communal collective life, and as I was saying, there plenty of social activities, lots of sports. Baseball was big, and I think that the way in which we grew up, I've thought about this a lot too, was what was different there, and what was different about race. I mean, clearly we were different. We were different from, obviously, most people who lived in the area who were white. And there were a few African Americans. They were usually farm workers for Seabrook Farms and other farming farming organizations. But I think that there was a collective development, a sense of our difference, but we kind of didn't have a sense of any kind of hierarchy that we were supposed to be deferential to. And this wasn't out of some opposition to oppression, so that could come later. But that it was clear to us growing up, and I think I can speak for a lot of people, that what was the big deal about white people? I mean, they weren't smarter than us, clearly. They weren't better athletes than us. That was clear too. So there wasn't, I think, growing up collectively as a Japanese American within a Japanese American community and dealing from that base, I think it made quite a bit of difference in the way we perceive the world. At least I'm speaking for myself. I would also note, and there was a question in the chat, my family, by the way, came to Seabrook around 1947. I was born in Poston, Arizona, one of the camps. My family moved to Arkansas in about 1944. And after a couple of years there, they moved to Seabrook Farms. And that's the period we're talking about. So you can do the math. I was born in 43. The larger migration of people to Seabrook Farms, I mean, we were part of a slightly later migration to Seabrook, but the larger migration was organized by, I mean, there Fuji Sasaki and Elo Nakamura, who had been in contact with people from Seabrook Farms. I think it was John Seabrook, the son of Charles F., who helped do this. And remembering that it was a period of time when there was a big labor shortage. in the United States because of the war. And you had internal migrations of people from the South moving, African Americans and others moving from the South for better paying jobs in the North, and moving out of farm work or farm labor work, and that's I think Seabrook Farms was desperate. I mean, we can talk a little bit more about that later, but I think that is part of it. I mean, I know that there are benign interpretations, and I share some of them, but I would also say that there was also some basic market force operating, supply and demand, which I think reverberated to our favor. So getting back to the general sense of the community, we were people who were in that sense quite normal. I mean, we didn't. It's interesting that I mean, I don't know how many reunions there have been in subsequent years since those of us who grew up there have left the community. Though I stay in regular touch, my sister still lives in the general area, but there have been reunions, on the West Coast, in Nevada, and there was a big reunion in about 4 years ago, and we always talk about, of course, the old days, which seem to be getting increasingly older in time. And we reflect on what was different and special. And I think I'm touching on some of those points. We did have a sense of a community. We did also feel autonomous. And I also had friends who were Estonians, and they came out of a different cultural and social base, much more than the Japanese Americans who were in Seabrook. They were a community that, as displaced people, were probably part of what would have been called the upper middle class of Estonia. At least a number of them were. I had friends whose fathers were either like a mayor or a governor. I think one of the leading opera singers in Estonia was, lived in the community, etc. So there was a different social base, but it was a good community in that sense, and a democratic community in that sense. And I've thought about, as I've noted, what made that so, and what I think about it now. And I should say that that my trajectory as an individual, I mean, in terms of my own personal beliefs and activities, are not conservative. I haven't been probably for 50 years, 60 years. And yet I still feel an attachment, a very close attachment to this community, which was not open at that time to progressive notions. And I think there has been an image projected about Seabrook, which I'd like to look at and perhaps to some extent counter, but I also think it has some force that has to be respected. I think the general feeling I had in the way in which, to the extent that there was reflection about Seabrook and the Japanese community within it, was that what happened to us was like an earthquake or a tsunami, that it was terrible. It was fundamentally dislocating. And there were resulting hardships, but we recovered. We survived, and we survived for all kinds of reasons, including our own sense of solidarity and self-help. And in this particular perspective, the community is seen as and this was, I think, a very kind of clear point of view, that we kind of redeemed or were exemplary or examples of the possibilities of the American dream. That is, that in the face of obvious racial discrimination and various obstacles placed in our way, but the Japanese community not only survived out of Seabrook, but they thrived. Now, I take issue with aspects of this, but I can't deny that there aren't some truths here. I mean, in the sense that, as I noted earlier, I mean, there was a very much an achievement orientation in the community. Now, it's not to say that everybody came out of there an honor student or a star athlete, but I think, you know, they were people who generally reflected credit on the community, if I may say that. But I think one of the things I discovered, I mean, let me back up here a little bit. In the early 60s, which is a much longer narrative here, but I got engaged with the civil rights movement in the South, and for about a little bit over a year, and I came back to Seabrook. And the movement helped put my antenna up, so to speak, in terms of social issues and issues of racism and exclusion. And it became clear to me that one of the things that was happening in Seabrook was that African Americans didn't live where we lived. They lived in Seabrook. I mean, they lived in these little pockets of in housing that was much. I mean, there was never any housing that was luxurious, but they probably lived in the worst housing in the community. It wasn't. It was clearly some kind of a policy, but nobody in Seabrook ever owned up to it. I mean, I can remember going to the Seabrook housing office, morally indignant with my sister, and asking, "Hey, what the hell is going on here?" There was no real answer. I mean, this is the way it's done. So there were real significant gaps in the notion of interracial harmony here, and I applaud the Seabrook Education and Cultural Center, which I'm a board member, and and it's headed by the grandson of Charles F. Seabrook, in beginning to examine some of these things that happened at Seabrook Farms and continue to happen. So I think that's an obvious and big kind of exclusion within the narrative, and I think there's going to be quite a bit of analysis and further research and that's called for in this. But saying all of that doesn't change my experience. It doesn't say that it was a lie, because it wasn't. I did have an idyllic childhood. Nobody's going to take that away from me. And it was a childhood that I think made me and others of my peers stronger as a result of it. I had a very interesting revelation once with my sister-in-law, who's a therapist, and I think in the course of giving what I think she thought was a compliment, she said to me that you're the most non-neurotic person I've ever known. And I said, and I thought about that, and I realized, but that's kind of how the guys I knew grew up. In other words, you know, the notion that you paid undue attention to yourself, you know, was kind of anathema, but that you sort of operated within a collectivity I mean, there were losses in that process as well, of course. But so in that sense, everybody I knew was non-neurotic. And it was a community that operated, maybe the edges were sanded down to some extent in that sense, but it was very much a vibrant living community, and I miss it. I do. And I reflected also on, as I think I've said part of it, what accounts for it, and what are the gaps, and obviously our community shared some of the basic blindness about Blacks in the culture, and despite our own collective experience, and that ought to be noted. And I think there have been some rectification in that over the years, through groups like the Japanese American Citizens League and their activism, and other groups of Japanese Americans who, in the course of their struggles for redress, I think have become very much a partner with groups of African Americans, Latinos, and others, Native peoples, in fighting for social justice. But there it is. One of the things I suppose that I've learned to accept, or at least to, if not necessarily revel in, is that human beings are incredibly contradictory and complicated. I mean, I know that there are people that I was quite friendly with growing up, white people, and they were friendly to me, but they were probably racist to their core in terms of their attitudes toward Black people or Puerto Ricans. And that's part of this history too. And it's part of the history that I think will need to be pulled out a bit. Because here again, it doesn't contradict my experience. It gives it some texture, some complexity that can be also quite scary. And I'd like to give a shout out. I don't know whether I did previously. The extent to which you did have people like Ella Nakamura and Fuji Sasaki who helped garner this community, who put it together, if you will, and for a 35-year period, it was a remarkable community. And I think I'm probably now beginning to explore more in depth than I had before, trying to put it in the full context of what this society is. I mean, we have a little drop of it, a dot, but it reflects, I think, both its possibilities and its contradictions, and I think it helps us understand better the kind of communities that we might build. Yeah. And I think now that I've probably blown my 35 to 40 minutes, I wanted to thank Harry, wherever he is, again. and I'd like to
I'm here.
And I'd like to,
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you, Harry. And I'd like to turn it back to Rob and whatever. I mean, we're making our adjustments here, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ed, and really look forward to engaging in this panel discussion with you. But first, I did want to hand it back over to Harry Sakamaki from Penn's Village Inclusiveness and Diversity Program, who's going to make a few remarks now. Harry?
Muted, Harry? Oops.
Rob, thank you very much. Yes, sorry about the technical. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, good. All right. Sorry about that. And my role is to introduce three guest speakers, but Ed, you introduced yourself so much, so maybe I will skip. Then I'd like to introduce the panelist, Alfred Hirotoshi Nishikawa. Can you wave your hand? Yes. Yes, thank you. And Hirotoshi Nishikawa is a native of San Francisco, and he's a Sansei, which means a third generation Japanese American. And during World War II, as a 4 years old, he and his family were sent to Boston, Arizona, and incarcerated for the duration of the war. Just like Ed, what a coincidence. Upon returning to California from concentration camp, his family settled in Gilroy, where he finished high school. He received a bachelor's degrees in biochemistry at UC Berkeley, and later PhD at Oregon State University. He was engaged over 30 years in biotech pharmaceutical drug discovery and development at Roche in New Jersey, and then GlaxoSmithKline in King of Prussia. He became involved with the Japanese American Citizen League, which Ed just shot a moment ago, in 1997, and has served as a Philadelphia chapter president and district governor. In the past 22 years, he has been active in social action and racial justice cause at the mainline Unitarian Church in Devon. Most recently, he has been involved at the mainline Unitarian Church, involved in comprehensive immigration reform with Pennsylvania Immigration and Citizen Coalition and Unitarian Universalit Pennsylvania Legislative Action Network. He's active on the board of Philadelphia Japan American Citizens League and the Japanese Association of Great Philadelphia. He was previously on the board of the Asian Arts Initiative, Japan American Society of Greater Philadelphia, and others. And he's a longtime supporter of the Curtis Institute of Music, the Kimmel Center, National Constitution Center, and the list goes on and on. Besides, he has also been a serious student of Japanese American history, avid photographer, and lover of classical music. Now I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Bob Buscher. He just explained about Japanese history in the video on the PowerPoint. Bob Buscher is a Philadelphia chapter president of Japanese American Citizens League following Hiro Nishikawa, and a lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania's Asian American Studies program. He sits on the board chair of the Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival, and he is a film as well as a media specialist, educator, arts administrator, published author who has worked in nonprofit arts organizations for over a decade. As a person of biracial Japanese American heritage, he is deeply involved in community. Rob also has expertise in cultural sensitivity training, community organizing, and advocacy issues related to the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. He is currently contributing a writer at the Pacific Citizen and GIDRA, the monthly of Asian American Experience newspaper. Rob is an accomplished guitarist and enjoy writing and performing music. Yeah, I'd like to hear his performance in the future. Now, I'd like to hand over to Rob. But before that, I'd just like to touch on the Penn's Village, which I belong to. This is a non-profit organization among 250 villages in the country to assist older neighbors to live independently in central Philadelphia by providing caring service and program that increases social engagement through the network volunteers. And I'd like to touch on the Inclusiveness and Diversity Initiative, which I belong to. As we live in such a multicultural city and the news of civil unrest on a daily basis, Penn's village took these moments very seriously and now supports and actively encourages a diverse and inclusive community of members, just like Ed touched on the civil rights. And diversity and inclusiveness means equally welcoming everyone, regardless of age, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, social economic status, physical abilities, religious belief, or political beliefs. For Penn's Village, I'd like to thank Japan American Society of Greater Philadelphia to share our mission and kindly cooperated today's event. Now I'd like to hand over to Rob for panel discussion. Rob, please.
Thank you very much, Harry, and really appreciate the Penn Village for co-sponsoring this panel. And thank you for those introductions as well. So let's just get right into it. At this point, I think what would be really interesting, Hiro, if you could kind of give us a little bit of a cross comparison to what your family's experience was like. Ed mentions this idea, obviously being born in a camp, slightly different than your experience being a child in the camp. And I know you were quite young, but you do have some conscious memories of that experience. But it's this kind of threefold migration that I think the entire community experienced in one way or another, because ultimately all of our families came from Japan at some point to the United States, were then forcibly removed from our homes on the West Coast and forced into the concentration camps. And then whether we resettled elsewhere or returned back to California or the West Coast, that's a third migration. So a lot of instability, obviously a lot of people lost, especially business owners or the farmers of the West Coast. They lost almost everything they had, if not everything. And maybe you could talk a little bit about what it was like for your family to have gone through that kind of triple migration and then ended up back in California in Gilroy.
Thank you, Rob. My grandparents came from Yamaguchi-ken in 1900. My parents were born in California in Watsonville at different times, but they were brought to Japan to grow up when they were little kids, because after World War I, my grandparents experienced economic depression in the farming business. They were farm workers. Anyway, my parents, when they were adults, came back to the States to exercise their American birthright and landed in San Francisco, where my father became a professional chef by training in a cooking school, and became a professional chef, put on fancy banquets, etc. And that became a lot more consistent livelihood than farm work, which was dependent on economic conditions a lot more. Anyway, so I was born in San Fran, and as were two of my brothers, Yukio and Tom. My third brother, youngest one, was born in Poston, Arizona in 1944 in February. So he has a unusual situation of having a birth certificate to a place in America that no longer physically exists. And he's now 77 or so. So that's one unexpected consequence of being a Nikkei, going through all of this. Anyway, I have a few childhood memories of being in camp. And one was having to do with funerals. Even though nobody in our immediate family died, we had, as a little kid, I heard for the first time in my life, a word called suicide. And I later learned on in studying the history of camp life that a lot of middle-aged and older men, mostly single, committed suicide because they became depressed due to the incarceration and the worry that whenever the war was going to end, they would end up being a burden to their friends and family because they didn't have a job. And so I ran into that and learned about inadvertently about suicide. The other memory I have about being a kid in Boston was in grade school. In my in April of 1945, we were called. All the students were called to the front of the school to the flagpole and to observe a ceremony of flag lowering, and while we pledged the allegiance and sang the Star Spangled Banner. And we were told that Mr. Roosevelt had just died the day before, and this was in his honor. Well, as a little kid, of course, I didn't know that this guy was the one that had signed this 9066 and got us stuck in this stupid camp in the first place. But I remember that because I didn't know what else to think about it. Anyway, so that was just a sampling of camp life. And the other thing about it is when the Supreme Court decision in the Mitsue Indo case decided to close because all the people who were incarcerated on the assumption that they were going to be they were potential criminals could not be supported by any government evidence. And so when this came about and the Supreme Court decision said that we need to be released, which the government WRA decided to officially do on January 2nd, 1945. Well, the war was still going on. There was shooting going on in Europe, shooting going on in the Pacific. And so people were in a quandary, even though they could leave. So those who began to leave usually left for the East Coast or the Midwest because it was safer. It was just stupid to go back to California. My father was not interested in exploring the next chapter in his life outside of California. So he wanted to go back, except that we were a poor family. We had no family assets, no property, no nothing. We had all our family property in suitcases that we carried into the camp. And that's all we were going to have to return back to the West Coast. So my father dawdled and trying to figure out what he was going to do related to cooking profession. Anyway, it was after about the time that the peace treaty was signed between America and Japan that our family finally decided to go back to California. But even then it was sort of hedgy. So we went back by train to San Jose, and then we were incarcerated, we were hosted in a temporary dormitory set up in the San Jose Betsuing, the Buddhist temple of historic nature. And so they took out all the pews and put in cots, and there was then 15, 20 families sleeping for weeks. Anyway, we were there about a week, and the government found empty dorms due to a camp naval camp in San Francisco, and provided us with a living space for as long as we wanted under the government hosting. So I went to, I think, the second and third grade there in San Francisco. Meanwhile, my father, through an old family friend, found this Chinese restaurant, a mom and pop restaurant in Gilroy, California. Those of you who know Gilroy, which is now known as the garlic capital of the world, let me tell you, when I was a kid growing up, you drive around the countryside, you can smell garlic being roasted all the time. Anyway, our mom and pop restaurant was a former Chinese restaurant all the way through World War II. And my father learned how to stir fry. And my mother was a head waitress. And so we ran this mom and pop shop for about 10, 12 years, all the way through when I finished high school. Anyway, those experiences were not too different from other people who were in a similar situation. Because the Nikkei population was, although more substantial than on the East Coast, they were spread out in a lot of communities geographically. So we were the only Nikkei family living in town, in the town of Gilroy. All my other friends, maybe there were about a dozen other kids who were sanseis like I am, and a few niseis living in the Gilroy area. Everybody else outside of our family were in farming. And but anyway, part of that was reflected in the fact that the JACL activity in the area was a lot more social and trying to provide some kind of a sense of community, even though the families were scattered around. So unlike Seabrook, where the families were sort of concentrated in a fairly narrow geographical area, our families in the California area were spread out, especially because of private farms. People own property scattered for miles. And bigger family farms, of course, have made the spacing even larger. And the one that was famous in Gilroy was the Hirotoshi family. And they had, their grandfather had come earlier in the 20th century and became a very successful farmer, et cetera, et cetera. And so they own, I don't know how many hundreds of acres. But, and others who had succeeded before the war and then were lucky enough to regain their property back after the war. Not everybody did that. Were economically on the move, developing. The other thing, I guess, is that because of families like us who were poor, didn't have much property or business or anything like that, education became the route to getting out of your economic rut. And so even though my parents had only barely finished high school due to the Depression, they kind of went along with the idea that I might go to college. So I was the first in my family to go to college. And my advisor happened to be Mr. Pine, the chemistry teacher, who was first my photography club advisor, because my father was an amateur Kodak person, got me interested in photography. But as Mr. Pine watched me learn how to develop film and stuff like that, which involved wet chemistry, he saw me take an interest in chemistry in the class and began to advise me, you ought to go to Berkeley because that's the best science school around here. And it's very cheap because you're a resident. Anyway, so I followed his advice and went to Berkeley and got into chemistry and then discovered something called biochemistry and majored in that and finished.
Thanks for sharing all of that, Hiro. I want to insert Ed into the conversation here because one of the things that you were talking about a little bit earlier was this idea, that here your parents are coming out of the camp and eventually are able to open their own small business with the restaurant in Gilroy. But essentially they're kind of, I don't know if they were doing this openly to their customers, but sort of masquerading as Chinese to an extent, right? But almost like passing within the context of this being a Chinese restaurant. Obviously your dad being a Japanese American, I'm sure he cooked great Japanese American and Japanese food too. But I guess, my question first for Ed and then kind of coming back to you on that one, Hiro, is more about this idea of the sort of perception of race and racism. And Ed, you talked a lot about not really facing these kinds of issues within the Seabrook community itself. But to what extent were you aware of this outside of your sort of isolated community? Did your family or did the community talk about racism or prejudice that was experienced sort of outside of this isolated Seabrook Farms community?
I think it's probably more subtle than I would have thought. I think there, as I was saying, I can't recall any kind of overt anti-Japanese stuff. You know, there was a sense, of course, that a lot of white people couldn't tell any Asian apart. You know, so I could have been Chinese or anything else. But I don't. I mean, you know, there are references to the Hagujins, you know, and you know, what are you gonna do about them? But as I said, there didn't seem to be when I was growing up, and I would make that, you know, prefatory comment that hostility. I mean, you know, and in subsequent years, you know, I'd be up in New Hampshire, and people would look at me, but it wouldn't. These were looks of curiosity. You know, they weren't trying to defend their community against the Asian hordes. So it's a mixed. I don't know where I mean, the racial consciousness. I think it was always clear we were different. I mean, that was sure. And I think my father was enough of a Japanese nationalist to probably inculcate some sense that not only were we different, we were better. I mean, it's I mean, I don't mean that he wasn't gross about it, but you know, he was certainly not, and he didn't project, and nobody in the community projected any sense of being inferior, or you know, or that we had to you know, that we had to mind our P's and Q's in that sense. So it's as I was saying, I mean, race is obviously a very complicated thing, and I, you know, I tell people generally that I think I became an Asian American in the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, it sort of, I didn't go into the Civil Rights Movement because I was a politically conscious Asian American. So it built that way, and I, you know, yeah, it's complicated, but that's what it is.
Yeah, thanks for adding that color to it. And Hiro, so I guess
let me just add that when we went back to California in '47 and after, we ran into lots of hostility. Walking to school could be dangerous. People beat up on us, hammered away. And so we had to figure out times and pathways to school to avoid guys that are waiting to beat us up. And that continued all the way kind of through the Korean War era. And it began to finally dissipate as war brides and so on like that came back from the East and began to have families. And the idea of mixed race families began to permeate the larger society. And so it started to calm it down. And of course, because the Korean War involved communism and all that, the political view switched to that more than anything. And Japan became, quote, an ally. And that helped a lot also. But there was a heck of an amount of Japanese antipathy when we came back after World War II. Not only that, related I had Chinese schoolmates, neighbors, and when they were before the war and right up to the war, they were wearing pins, shirt pins, saying, "I'm not Japanese" or "I'm Chinese," and they walked around with that at school so that the whites don't beat up on them. That's how bad it was.
Yeah, I had a couple of comments. I mean, I think one of the elements, and I don't know much about it, was that I think Seabrook Farms, as one of the biggest employers in the area, probably had some impact. I mean, maybe direct in saying, don't screw with our workers, or so I don't, that's not necessarily out of racial benevolence, but I do think as a practical matter for them, themselves as a corporation, I think there was some of that. In other words, but I don't know any particulars. But they, but their impact on the community was enormous.
Yeah, I mean, tailing on that particular point, Ed, the story that I'm familiar with is that Seabrook Farms started paying their workers in silver dollars, in actual cloth purses, as a very literal way of saying we're the ones who control the purse strings. And I think that only started in the months prior to the Japanese Americans being resettled there. So if I understand correctly, that that may have been sort of perceived as this maybe thinly veiled threat about being hospitable to the new workers.
Yeah, well, it was an example of how much economic impact there was. You can just trace the circulation of the silver dollars in the community. That was clear. I also, speaking to Hiro's point, I can recall, and you probably have this, getting a copy of Life magazine sometime around 1942, and one of the feature articles was how an alert Caucasian apparently could tell the difference between a Chinese and a Japanese, and that this was apparently a serious article in what was one of the largest magazines in the country.
Yeah, and I think that kind of is a testament to the prolific nature of anti-Japanese propaganda.
Oh
yeah. And I guess back to that point regarding the West Coast resettlement, Hiro, you kind of mentioned from your own schoolyard memories of maybe avoiding bullies. Do you have a sense? Did your parents talk openly about the fact that there was racism or prejudice, or perhaps give you some kind of indication that you had to be more careful because of your identity?
Oh yeah, the only thing they didn't do was talk about the war itself in terms of our camp experience. So we were sort of ignored in terms of any kind of a conversation about the camp experience per se. And I learned about it much later when I was an adult and interested in history, and when I would come back from college or work after that, and interviewing basically my mother for this kind of information to piece together our family experience. But other than that, my parents never talked about it during while we were growing up in Gilroy. The thing that they hammered away on was a old Japanese tradition or concept. Don't bring shame on your family. Don't screw up. Don't stick out and get hammered like a nail that sticks out. And so we were on the complementary to that, encouraged by the larger community to become more American, whatever the hell that meant. And so that was part of the behind the scene concepts that we were coached on as kids. So I became more interested in English. My English had been very poor because my mother and father, being Kibe, liked to speak in Japanese at home. And in third grade, I took home a letter from my teachers telling my parents to speak more English at home to me because my language development was so poor. So that had turned it around in the family itself. And then I had to really concentrate on studying and learning English, such that in high school, I took journalism in addition to English, and I became an editor of the school paper and a yearbook.
Thanks for telling us that story as well, Hiro. And I do want to kind of go to some of the audience questions at this point because we're getting close to the end of our time. We had one from Ellen Jacob, who was curious.
Rob,
Yeah. Sorry, Harry, did you say something? Okay.
sorry, go ahead.
Okay. The question was about your memories related to the atomic bombs, and obviously, Ed, you were still under 2 or 3 years old, so you wouldn't have memory of that incident. Hiro, I would doubt that you probably have too much conscious memory of that particular incident either. So maybe we can alter that question a little bit to say, did your families ever talk about the atomic bombs to your memory?
Well, only in the context, because they're not scientists or anything. All they said was, there was, I think, a Japanese term, what was that?
Shikataganai?
No, the bomb itself.
Oh, Genbaku?
No,
Pikoto?
there's another word. Anyway, they use that term, that this is a remarkable event, you know, that wiped out hundreds of thousands of people in one few seconds. And that kind of thing, you know, as an idea, of course, left an impression. I didn't know what an atomic bomb was. I didn't know what eventually what became the hydrogen bomb. I read about it in school, but it was noted within the Nikkei community because it was such a devastating weapon to be used against people who look like us.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of those issues that
Japanese say "kadon."
they kind of grew in importance as I got older, because you know, you think about, yeah, who gets these? I mean, what communities are the victims of these bombs? I mean, Asians. And you know, I can recall there had been discussion of using tactical nuclear weapons in Vietnam, you know, and following that same notion. And of course, the heaviest hydrogen bomb testing took place in the Pacific, and the Pacific Islanders got, you know, often communities got obliterated. So it sort of kind of underscored a growing sense of consciousness about.
Yeah, and along that line, you know, when many decades later, I met my first hibakusha who were visiting the Northeast, and I was impressed by their persistence and driven energy in trying to bring about stopping a worldwide agreement, making a worldwide agreement to have no more nuclear weapons by anybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my great-grandparents both immigrated from Hiroshima, and my great-grandmother was a Kibe. So she grew up in a house in Higashi Hiroshima, which was close enough to the city that the house's roof was demolished by the bomb. But thankfully, her cousins who were home at the time were not impacted by it. Although several of the family members did perish who were working or going to school in the city. So at least within our family, Hiroshima being our ancestral homeland, this was a topic of oft conversation, but also my mother had traveled back to meet the relatives with her grandmother, and I also had the opportunity to visit our family home a couple times. But it's one of those interesting questions, and I think it's another one that we could probably have another hour-and-a-half long panel about. But I'd like to turn to another audience question, which is related to the payment of reparations. Mike Pulsifier asks, did America ever pay reparations to the families who were incarcerated in World War II? And of course, that answer is yes, with regards to the redress movement and the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, in which all surviving persons who were incarcerated were paid an amount of $20,000 and given a formal apology from then President Reagan. So either Hiro or Ed, if you'd like to add anything to that as well.
Well, I was not involved in JCL until much later in my life, except for that one event when I got a letter from my parents living in California. I was already living in the East, which was forwarded from the agency that was set up to disperse all the apologies and checks. And that was the first time I was aware of all the activities within JACL, but I hadn't been involved myself per se, because I was focused on my drug discovery career, like a lot of other, quote, Asians who are involved in science and engineering. Anyway, so I remembered that, and then I filed my papers, and I got a letter from George Herbert Walker Bush, who was in office at that time that the dispersals began, and a check for $20,000.
Yeah,
And I ended up a few years after that donating $1,000 every year to the JACL, because I was inspired by other people I knew who, in fact, from the get-go, donated their money to the JACL.
yeah, I thought the redress movement was a great kind of moment of unity within the Japanese American community. I mean, because I know that, and I discovered I was on the staff of the American Friends Service Committee at the time, and I had helped to craft the statement from the organization to the commission originally, but calling for the redress payments. But there had been some serious cleavages, fractures in the community, related to all kinds of things. I mean, including, and it was reflected later in terms of the strategies that, for the redress process. I mean, ultimately, that was united around going forward to Congress. But I thought that it was a moment in which those groups, which had, these still very strong feelings. I mean, going back to the No-No Boys and the Heart Mountain resistors, that they coalesced, and it was a great victory, I thought, because it was correctly narrated as a human rights issue, not a special interest, and I think that was crucial.
Well, there's a book called Achieving the Impossible Dream, which is the history of all that. And that's an interesting title, rather apt, I think, given the odds that most people felt within the JA community that,
Yeah.
what are our chances? Close to zero, because already at that point, the Nikkei population was less than 1% of the US. So who are we going to convince? But because it was made a national issue, I think it was barely able to make it through Congress.
Well, and it's kind of interesting now, because I think at this moment when we're in a renewed conversation related to civil rights and equity, there have been more of these questions related to how does the US do restorative justice to other communities, and in particular, looking at actually studying the long-term impacts of slavery on the African American community. And a number of Japanese American activist organizations have been very involved in calling for those reparations, at least the beginning of a study, because essentially the Congressional Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment Camps that the Congress commissioned was what led to the foundation of the redress, and ultimately paved the way for this apology and the monetary compensation to follow. So if anything, it sort of is a potential case study or test case for what perhaps African Americans and maybe even Native Americans could put forth in years to come.
Right.
Right. I know we do have a few more questions, but we're also close to time. Maybe we could just end with the question related to how the Japanese American community has been impacted by the pandemic. I think I thought about this often in the last couple of months, in particular, as it became clear that we're kind of in for a much longer time before things resume normality. With many vaccines still in the pipeline. I guess one of the things, harkening back to Ed's statement about the sort of unity that was experienced during the redress time period. We've also started to see some of that in an online space with Japanese Americans. I know with regards to last summer's Tadaima virtual pilgrimage, typically there are annual pilgrimages made back to the former incarceration sites by survivors and descendants. And those are very important community events. But in lieu of having them in person with the social distancing guidelines, about 60 organizations nationwide came together to actually co-sponsor an entire 9 weeks of free online events that really helped to bring the community, no matter where they lived, from across the country to around the world, into conversation with one another. So at least I guess my take on it is that, you know, although the pandemic has been very damaging in so many ways, it's also sort of helping us to rethink how we build community. And I'm not sure if either of you have other thoughts that you'd like to add before we close out.
Well, I guess I would only note that as a community, we're not unaccustomed to catastrophe. I mean, you know, there's the major dislocations and extended periods of disaster. That's part of our history. That doesn't necessarily help, maybe, but it does give some perspective that issues of solidarity and the ability to hang in there are important.
Well, my mother and father used to say, how we survived camp was gaman. And so I should tell my grandkids, gaman. That's how we're going to survive COVID-19.
I think that's a great way to kind of bring it back to a whole, right? And, you know, gaman in many ways, but also gambatte, right? And to fight on. So yeah, I mean, thank you both for joining us for this conversation. I mean, I feel like we're still barely scratching the surface here, but being respectful of everyone's time, I wanted to hand it back over to the folks at Japan America Society if anyone wanted to close us out.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rob, Hiro, and Ed. And it's been a really wonderful event. And I hope we can do this annually. And thank you to Harry for actually coming up this idea, bring it to us. And thank you so much for James for technical support today, and Kim for intro, and most importantly, Ed, Hiro, and Rob. Thank you so much for sharing this story, and what an inspiring events this was. And thank you so much. And thank you all for coming. This was a first sold out event, and we'll continue to do good programming. So stay tuned for more Japan American Society Greater Philadelphia events. Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay.